Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the narrative writing tasks found on the Georgia Milestones assessment. My name is Jennifer Jones, and I am the Director of Curriculum here at Top Score Writing. If you have any questions following today's presentation, please feel free to email me at Jen, that's Jen, at topscorewriting.com. I'm always happy to answer any questions that you may have. Now, the students are going to be expected to participate in several different writing demands on the Georgia Milestones assessment. One of the writing tasks they'll be presented with is called the extended writing response. Now, this is when students are presented with a text set comprised of multiple passages, and then they are given a prompt that will direct them to write either an informative or explanatory essay or an opinion essay. Now, we have created an entirely separate presentation that looks at that extended writing response in-depthly and goes over both the rubrics, the sample papers, and the expectations for students on the extended writing response. So if you're interested in that portion of the Georgia Milestone Assessment, please feel free to view that particular presentation. If you email me, I'd be happy to send it your way. Today, though, we are going to dive in depth into that extended constructed response. So this is when students are going to be presented with a text set comprised of multiple passages. The passages may be two literary passages, so two stories, or they could be two informational passages, two nonfiction pieces of writing, or it could be a paired passage set, which is when they're going to be given one literary and one informational article. After students read their passages, they will be presented with a prompt that is going to direct them to write a narrative story. And this particular response is going to be worth up to 4 points. Now, these prompts that the students are given are going to ask them to do one of three things. They may ask the students to write a new beginning or a new ending to a literary story. Or they may ask the students to write an original story based upon an informational passage set. So this one is where the students really need to be creative. They have to come up with their own characters, situation, conflict, events, and they need to write a solid narrative while also informing or teaching their audience about what they read about. The third task students may be presented with is to rewrite a specific part of the story from a different point of view or a different character's perspective. Now, in order to respond to any of these prompts, students are going to need to know how to write a solid, well-constructed, well-organized narrative. They need to know how to create interesting, vivid characters, how to create a sequence of events where there is a beginning, a middle, and an end that flows in a logical and natural way. They need to know how to use narrative transitions to show that time is passing. They need to know how to use narrative techniques to really develop the events and the characters. So that includes description, sensory language, colorful language, dialogue. Now, the state is very clear on what they are going to be looking for in the narratives. So they have come up with rubrics for grades 3 through 8. And we're going to be taking a look at the rubrics for 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade in just a second. The state says, though, that they're going to be looking for a few things in all students' narratives. They're going to be looking for their use of narrative techniques, and the state defines this as dialogue, description, and word choice. They're going to be looking at the details that students use to describe the events, the characters, and then the character's response to the situations that they are in. And finally, they're going to be looking for a clear sequence of events. Does the story flow naturally? Does one event lead into the next? There are unique rubrics for each grade level, as I just mentioned. We're going to look first at the 3rd grade rubric, and then we're going to talk about the increased expectations for grades 4 and 5. Now, the rubrics are helpful, but what's even more enlightening for all of us are the student sample papers. Now, the sample papers are actual students' essays that the state has graded, and they have released to all of us for review. These samplers are going to show us how the state is interpreting their own rubric, how they are scoring. Because what we want to do as educators is we want to align the way we score our students' essays to the way that they will be scored on the statewide writing assessment. That way we can make sure we are preparing our students to be as successful as possible. Now, the whole goal of this presentation is to leave you with a very clear understanding of what your students will need to do on the narrative portion of the Georgia Milestones assessment. We also want you to understand how your students are going to be scored, how they can earn those full 4 points. What is the state really looking for? And we're going to share some ideas on how you can ensure that they are prepared to each do as well as possible. This is the assessment blueprint for the Georgia Milestones assessment for grade 4. So you can see that we're going to be talking about the 4-point extended constructed response, which is where students are going to be asked to write a narrative. Now, before we look at the rubric, there's a few things to keep in mind. The rubric is not a checklist, and the rubric is open to a great deal of interpretation. So you're going to see in a moment how so many of the words found on the rubric are subjective. They are qualifying words that describe how well a student demonstrates a particular writing skill. So you're going to see a lot of words on the rubric, such as effective and logical. These words are open to interpretation. Don't worry, before today is over, you will leave with a clear understanding of how the state defines those words. When we look at the rubric, though, keep in mind that it is not a checklist. What I mean by that is you may look at a student's narrative and say, well, parts of their narrative fall under the description of a level 4, and parts of their narrative fall under the description of a level 3. And you know what? There's even this one part of their narrative which really falls under the description of a level 2. That is very natural. So when we are scoring, and when the state of Georgia scores, they score holistically. They look at the essay as a whole. Whatever the majority of the essay, whichever score point, I should say, the majority of the essay corresponds to, that is the score that the student will earn. So when we look at a student's essay or their narrative, if the majority of their narrative corresponds to a level 3, even if a little bit of it is a level 4 and a little bit's a level 2, if the majority of their narrative corresponds to the description of a level 3, then they will earn a score of 3. Even if part of the level 3 description is missing, if the majority of the narrative is a level 3, that's what they will earn. So it's not a checklist. They don't have to meet every single expectation for a certain score point in order to earn that particular score. So I know that's a little confusing, but I think it'll make more sense in just a second when we look at the actual rubrics. So here is the 3rd grade narrative rubric. So again, we're going to start with the 3rd grade rubric, and then we'll talk about how 4th and 5th grade have slightly higher expectations. So when we look at this rubric, you can see on the left-hand side, there are the points 4, 3, 2, and then the page behind it has a description for a score of 1. Then on the right-hand side, it says criteria, and there's a list of bullet points. The bullet points are going to be the descriptive characteristics of that particular score point. Now let's take a look at each bullet point, and you're going to see how each score point lists the same writing skills. What's going to change from score to score is the skill level that the student demonstrates that particular writing technique. All right, so first bullet point, it says, effectively establishes a situation and introduces a narrator or characters. Okay, so for level 4, they have to effectively establish a situation and introduce a narrator and characters. Under a 3, it says establishes a situation and introduces one or more characters. Under a 2, it says introduces a vague situation and at least one character. Okay, so what's changing from 4 to 3 to 2? Well, all students are expected to establish a situation, right? If the students do it effectively, that's a 4. If they just do it, it's a 3. If they introduce it, but it's vague, then it's a 2. Look at the second bullet point. For a level 4, it says organizes an event sequence that unfolds naturally. The second bullet under a 3 says organizes events in a clear logical order. And under a 2, the second bullet point says organizes events in a sequence, but with some gaps or ambiguity. So everyone has to have a sequence of events, right? If they do it in a way that unfolds naturally, the student will earn a 4. If they do it in a clear, logical manner, they will earn a 3. If they do it, but there's some gaps, they'll earn a 2. Now let's look at the third bullet point. For a level 4, it says effectively uses narrative techniques, such as dialogue and description, to develop interesting experiences and events or show the responsive characters to situations. Under a 3, the third bullet point reads, uses narrative techniques, and then the rest is the same. Under a 2, it says attempts to use a narrative technique, and the rest is the same. So all students are expected to use these narrative techniques of dialogue and description. If they effectively use them, they get a 4. If they just use them, they get a 3. If they attempt to use them, they get a 2. So are you already seeing the confusing part of the rubric? These qualitative words are open to interpretation. What does effectively mean? How is effectively different from clear and logical? Who says what an attempt is versus just using it? So much of this rubric is open to interpretation. It's very tricky to score students' essays accurately by only referring to the state rubric. And this is true for most states. The rubrics are open to a great deal of interpretation because, of course, scoring writing is subjective, right? If I was to score an essay or you were to score an essay, you might define an effective established situation differently than I would. So how do we know how to define all of these subjective words? How do we align our definitions of effective and clear and logical with the state's? We do that by referring to the state sample papers. And that's what we're going to devote the bulk of our presentation to today. We're going to be looking at the sample papers released by the state of Georgia in-depthly. The sample papers are our best friends as educators. The sample papers are real student essays scored by the state of Georgia, where the Georgia not only gives us the score, but they also give us a whole list of notes where they explain why that student earned that particular score. They allow us to see what an effective situation is versus just an established situation. They allow us to see what events that unfold naturally are compared to events that are just clear and logical. Now, the 4th and the 5th grade rubric are identical to the 3rd grade rubric, except for a few increased demands. 4th graders are also going to be asked to use concrete words and phrases, sensory language. They're going to be asked to convey events and experiences precisely and provide a conclusion versus a sense of closure. 5th graders are going to have the exact same rubric as 4th graders, except they have one additional narrative technique listed, and that is pacing, the pacing of events. So the rubrics for 3rd through 5th grade are very similar to one another. 4th grade has a few extra demands, pretty much it's word choice, and then 5th grade has one extra narrative technique that students can use. Now let's take a look at a quick summary of the key elements on a rubric. So as I mentioned, the things listed under a 4, a 3, a 2, and a 1 are the same. What changes is those qualitative words, the words that are reflective of how well a student uses or demonstrates that particular writing skill in their essay. All students, though, are going to be expected to do some of the same things. All students will need to establish a situation. They will need to introduce one or more characters. In order to earn the full 4 points, they should also have a narrator. All students will be expected to include sequential events and to show time is passing or one event is moving to the next event through the use of narrative transition words. All students will need to use narrative techniques such as dialogue and description. Students should be intentional about word choice, and depending on their grade level, it depends how specific they need to be. But as they progress from 3rd to 5th grade, students really need to increase in their intentionality of the words they use in their essay. So concrete words, sensory language, precise vocabulary versus general vocabulary. If they are writing in response to informational articles, we want them to use some of that domain-specific vocabulary as well. All students need to have narratives that end in a way that feels satisfying, feels complete, and makes sense based upon what happened in the middle and in the beginning of their stories. Students always need to integrate information from the text that they read. So whether they are writing writing in response to a literary story, an informational set of passages, or a paired passage set, they will always need to incorporate some detailed information from what they read. When students are writing their grammatical errors should not interfere with the meaning of the essay or their narrative. So what I mean by that is the state understands that students are writing a first draft in a time situation. They're not looking for perfection. If students make a few mistakes of different varieties, if they make a few punctuation mistakes and a few capitalization mistakes and a few spelling mistakes, but there's not a pattern of errors and the errors do not affect the readability of the story, they're not going to lose any points. When students begin to have a pattern of errors, like for example, if they never use punctuation correctly in their story, they're going to lose a point there. If students' errors are so severe that it makes the narrative confusing for the reader, they will also lose points. So a goal for all students is just to ensure that they do not have a pattern of grammar, conventional, or spelling errors, and that their errors do not affect the readability of the narrative on the part of the reader. All right, so the big $1 million question is, how do we define all of these subjective words? And as we just talked about, those scoring samplers are going to be the place we go to find out what does effectively mean, or consistently, or rich, or naturally, or appropriate, or some, right? How do we define all of these qualitative subjective words? The sample papers, as well as the rubrics, as I'm sure you know, are available on your state website. So this is the address where you can go to find all of the information that I'm going to be presenting to you today. Now, what I recommend is that everyone go to your state website and print out all of the scoring sample papers that are available. I would hole punch them, put them in a binder along with the rubrics, and keep that with you whenever you are scoring your students' essays. It takes a bit of time to learn how to score how the state does, but it is time well spent. Because if we do not align our scoring as a school to how the state scores, then our data, when we turn it into our administration, has no validity. If I score student A's narrative a 4, and my partner next door would have scored it a 2, and then the teacher down the hall scores it a 3, well, we're not all scoring in the same way. Some of us are not as scoring in the way the state does. So how could our admin and our coaches, or even us as classroom teachers, how could we track our students appropriately and monitor their growth? So in order to develop a consistent scoring system that has validity, we all need to score together as a team so that we have opportunities to have collaborative conversations, to analyze papers together. And we will always defer to not only the rubrics, but the sample papers when scoring, to make sure we are scoring in the same way that the state does. All right, so let's take a look at the 3rd grade sample papers first. So the 3rd grade narrative samples were all in response to the same prompt. And the writing task is, imagine someone brings you food from a strange plant. They want to know if the food is a fruit or a vegetable. Write an original story in which you work to find out if the food is a fruit or a vegetable. So 3rd graders are presented with 2 informational passages, all about fruits and vegetables, how we know the difference. And then they have to create a story where there are characters and events and a conflict or a theme. And throughout the story, they have to also inform their reader about how you can tell the difference between fruits and vegetables. It's a lot, right? The state of Georgia does a great job of providing all students with a narrative writer's checklist, which tells the students in more specific terms what they are expected to include in their narrative. So you can see that 3rd graders are encouraged to write about either a real or an imagined experience. So that means they can write a personal or a fictional narrative. They need to make sure to introduce a situation and a narrator and or characters. They need to organize their events and use words and phrases to show the sequence. That means narrative transitions. They need to use dialogue and descriptions of actions, thoughts, feelings to develop not only the events, but the character's response to these events. They need to make sure they include a conclusion that feels natural and satisfying. And of course, don't forget to use details and information from that informational text set that they just read. So let's start off by looking at a student, I should say, that earned a score of 4. So a student that earned a perfect score, the full 4 points you can possibly earn. This is from the 3rd grade sample set, sample number 1. On the top right-hand side, this is the student's actual essay. The bottom left-hand side is the state's annotations. So the state, as I mentioned at the beginning, not only tells us what score the student earned, but gives us notes as to why they earned that particular score. So this student earned a 4, and here's why. They effectively established a situation. Now, remember that on the rubric, and we were all wondering, what does effectively establish as a situation mean? Well, it means that they really describe the setting in which the story takes place, the time, the place, and the environment. They also introduce the central theme of the story, which is going to be, how do you tell a fruit from a vegetable, right? Now, the next thing that we wanted to define is, what does it mean when it says the sequence is organized and unfolds naturally? Remember, that was different from a sequence that just had a clear logical order. Well, when you analyze all of the samples that earned a full 4 points, and anytime the state says the sequence is organized and unfolds naturally, what that means is that the student has 2 to 3 different events that take place. So there's more than one event. Each event is developed a little bit in depthly, so not a tremendous amount for each event, but a few sentences for each event. And there are narrative transitions that show how one event leads to another event. Now, the ending of this story is very natural. So the state says it's a sense of closure that follows the events. What that means is that this student included a conclusion to their story that is a few sentences in length and goes back to that central theme that was introduced in the very beginning of the story. So at the beginning of the story, the student says it's a nice regular Friday night. They're sitting at the island in their kitchen. They're eating dinner. In fact, they're eating tomato soup. And a friend comes over and they say, hey, I have this green bean plant. I don't know, is it a fruit or is it a vegetable? And the students go through this whole discussion and activity where they figure out that green beans are actually a fruit. The student explains why. And at the end, the friend that came over says, oh, thank you so much. I see what you mean. You're right. There is a seed. Now I get it. It is a fruit. It's confusing, but seeds mean fruit. Thank you so much. And the main narrator says, you're welcome. It was a good time, right? So the conclusion follows the events naturally. It's not an abrupt ending. It's not, and now it's a fruit, the end, right? The student takes time to write multiple sentences to make that conclusion feel satisfying. Something else that we noted about the narratives that earned a full 4 points, they had multiple characters. So you'll see in the bottom left on those annotated notes, you see multiple is circled. We really wanted to bring that to your attention. The essays, that earned a score of 4 had more than just 1 or 2 characters. So you see in this instance, there's the narrator. It's told in first person point of view, I, right? And there are 2 other characters. There is Steve and there is Jaden. So Jaden is the boy, the friend that comes over to the narrator's house, and Steve is one of Jaden's classmates. It appeared that any student that earned a 4 did use 3 characters or more in their narrative. So that's something to keep in mind when we're working with our students. Now, a question that we always get, and I'm sure this is something you're probably wondering, is, well, how can I help my students to do these very important things? How can I help them establish a situation, create events that unfold naturally, and then write a logical, natural conclusion that is satisfying? That comes back to planning. Okay, so in order for our students to be able to do all of these things well, they must plan before they start their narrative. They need to plan in a way that is quick and efficient. We do not want them spending half an hour creating a plan, right? We want them devoting the majority of their testing time to actually writing their narrative. We want them to spend 5, maybe 10 minutes at the most planning. They need a quick, easy, effective way to plan. So here at Top Score, we teach them to plan with a BTE outline. Now, BTE is an acronym. B stands for beginning, T stands for things that happened, and E stands for ending. Now, this blank BTE outline that you see in the bottom right-hand corner has 5 parts. So this would be a beginning, 3 main events, and an ending. Now, you can modify a BTE outline. If the student only wanted to have 2 main events, it could be B, T1, T2, and E, and that would be fine. Remember, we want our students to have more than 1 event, though, in their stories in order to score high on this portion of the Georgia Milestone Assessment. Now let's continue to look at the same sample paper. So again, the same sample number 1 that earned the full 4 points. But now, instead of looking at structure and the events, let's look at the narrative techniques that the student used. So remember for a 4, it said they need to effectively use those narrative techniques such as detail and description. Look at what this student does. He uses a great deal of dialogue to show the conversation between himself and his friend that comes over. He also uses a lot of description. There are color words, there are movement, there are sounds, there are details. These descriptive techniques are so important to a narrative story because they are what allow the audience to truly visualize what is happening. Adding dialogue and description is what takes a 5-sentence story into a story that is half a page in length. Okay, so you can see we have circled some of the dialogue and description that was used by the student in order to really develop each of the events and also the characters' responses to the events. And that was something that the rubric was very specific about. It's not enough to just describe the events. The students also need to describe how the characters react to the events. Are they surprised? Are they worried? Are they overjoyed? The other thing that the rubric is going to ask our students to do is to integrate ideas and details effectively. So that means information from the articles or sources they read. That information needs to be incorporated into their original story. So this student did that. He talks about how green beans are a fruit, how fruits have seeds, how fruits often look like vegetables, but they're not, even though that's confusing. Anything with a seed is a fruit. Something that we notice about the high scoring essays, they utilized 3 or more details and pieces of information from what they read. If students only included 1 detail from what they read in their story, they usually did not earn a 4. So students need to select multiple details, multiple pieces of information from that text set and include it in their story in order to receive the full 4 points. So now let's compare that 4 that we just looked at to a 3. Okay, so this is sample number 4 from the 3rd grade set. This is a student that only earned 3 points. So let's just look at it very quickly. Do you see how short it is? Right? This was a 4. This is a 3. Now, length matters. Quality over quantity, of course. We don't want half a page of just fluff writing that doesn't say anything. But quantity also matters because if you think about it, if students are going to write a story that has multiple events, if they are really going to describe each and every event, if they're going to describe how the characters react to the events, if they are going to have a conclusion that is well developed, if they're going to utilize 2 or 3 different details or facts from the text set, well, then guess what? Their narrative's going to be a bit longer. Okay, so length does matter. Here are some things, just overall observations of narratives that earned a 3 versus narratives that earned 4. The narratives that earned a 3 usually only had 2 characters instead of 3 characters. So remember that first sample we looked at had the narrator, Jaden and Steve? This one only has 2 characters, and that was a consistent trend amongst the narratives that earned a 3. The beginning only minimally describes the setting and establishes the situation. So the only descriptive language used for the setting in this example was, it was the day my friend Izzy was moving to Florida. That's it. Remember how in the other one, it was a Friday night and he was sitting at his kitchen island and he was eating tomato soup? This one just says it was the day my friend was moving to Florida. So this is minimally establishing the setting or describing the setting and simply establishing the situation. This is establishing the situation. The other one was effectively establishing a situation. The state says that this one has a logical order of events versus events that unfold naturally. What is the difference? These events, there's multiple events, but the segue from one to the other is more abrupt, right? It doesn't flow from one to the other. This student does not use narrative transition words in the way the other student did. So we don't know how much time is passing. The events are not gracefully segueing from one to the other because this student is not using narrative transitions. It's an abrupt change in events. There is very little description and dialogue used in this story, right? So there's not much development of either the situations or the character's response to the situation. There's really only 1 detail from the source text that was included. It's a very quick ending. Bye. And it's over, right? Remember how the other one involves some discussion between the boys at the end? This one just says, thank you, I'll miss you, bye. So how can we help our students to incorporate more information from what they read in the stories they write? So a quick tip I have for you for that. In our top score bonus lessons, where we teach students to write text-based narratives, one of the strategies we teach them is that when they are reading those informational text sets, they should underline any important information that they think they could use in their narrative. So you see on the bottom right-hand side, that's an example of one of our informational text sets that accompanies our text-based narrative lesson. And here is an example from the teacher lesson plan of where the teacher is underlining important details and information that they think they may be able to use in their narrative. When we have our students do that, that gives them a wealth of details that they can pull from and include in their narratives when they're writing them. All right, now let's go a little bit lower. What do we not want to do? So this is sample number 10 from 3rd grade. Just so you know, there's 12 sample papers for every grade level that the state's been released. So this is number 10. This student only earned a 1. Okay, so let's look at this, and I'm sure the first thing that's going to jump out to you is just how incredibly short this is. Now, some trends that we noticed from all of the narratives that earned a 1 in 3rd grade. Most of them only had one character. It was just the narrator. The situation was only minimally introduced, and it was often too short to really have a beginning, middle, and end, right? There really are no events simply because it is so short. There is no narrative techniques used. There's no dialogue. There's no description. There are no narrative transitions because there really are no events, right? So there is no time passing. The student is only using one small detail from the source. And that's if you pick it out of the ground and you see that there's seeds, you know it's a fruit. Excuse me, if you see seeds, you know it's a fruit. If you pick it out of the ground, it's a vegetable. There's no closing, there's no conclusion, because again, there is no beginning or middle, so there can be no ending. And there are errors that are so frequent that they do interfere with the meaning of the essay. So these are some common things we noticed in students that earned only 1 point. All right, now let's dive into the 4th grade sample narratives. 4th graders were given 2 literary passages to read. One is called The Golden Fish, and one is called Henry's Lesson. And they were also given this prompt. In the story, Henry's Lesson, a big fish eats the meat Henry drops into the river. Think about how this event might change the way Henry acts from now on. Write a story about what happens the next day when Henry's owners take him for a walk in the park. And what's the first thing that we notice about this prompt? Well, it's not asking students to write in response to both passages. The students do not need to write in response to the golden fish at all. In fact, they should not mention anything about the golden fish or those characters or that story in the narrative they write. The students are only being asked to write an extension to the Henry's Lesson story. I really wanted to point this out to you to emphasize the importance of teaching our students to accurately analyze a prompt. The very first step to writing a well-constructed narrative is to write it about what the prompt says to write it about. There's nothing worse than seeing students write a fabulous narrative, but it's not based on the correct thing. So for that reason, I know at Top Score, we have created multiple lessons focused specifically on teaching students how to analyze a prompt and determine specifically what they're being asked to write about. That's a crucial first step. The second thing I wanted to point out about this prompt is that students are going to need to have a good understanding of plot elements before they can write in response to this narrative. So for example, they're going to need to understand character traits. They need to understand Henry and his personality. How does he act? What does he think? What does he feel? Then they are going to need to analyze the events in the story and imagine how these new events would shape or change Henry's personality and the way he acts and will behave and think and speak in the future. So yes, step number 1, we have to teach our students how to analyze a prompt. Step number 2, we have to teach them how to analyze these literary passages to determine the plot elements so that when they write their original narrative, they can maintain the elements that need to be maintained. Some prompts like this one are going to require the students to identify the main characters and their traits. Other prompts are going to require students to identify the setting. There's lots of different prompts. And so something we've also developed at Top Score are bonus lessons where we teach our students how to analyze these literary passages for those specific plot elements and determine those elements before they begin writing their original narrative. All right, so let's take a look at the sample essays released by the state. So let's start by looking at the ones that earned a 4. So this is sample paper number 1. The student earned the full 4 points. Now, you will see in pink are some big arrows pointing out some important things about the student's essay. This student also effectively established a situation and characters. Now, that's the state's language that you see in italics, italicized, and bolded. In the regular font, you see it says setting and connection to source. That is where we are defining for you what it means to effectively establish a situation and characters. The student is basically describing the setting, and they are making a connection to the original source text and what the theme of this whole narrative is going to be. Now, the state says that this sequence is organized. And again, this unfolds naturally. Remember, the events have to unfold naturally in order for the student to earn the full 4 points. Well, what does that mean? Once again, we have a student who is writing a story that has 3 main events. The student is also using some narrative transitions to allow one event to transition into the next event. The conclusion follows the narrated experiences. That's the state's language. Conclusion follows narrated experiences. What does that mean? The ending connects to the events, right? So the way this story ends is satisfying. It leaves the reader with a sense of completeness because it connects to the events that happened in the middle. When students plan their essay out beforehand, they are better able to create those conclusions that are natural endings to the middle events. Now, some observations that we noticed in all of the essays that earned the full 4 points in 4th grade. They were approximately half a page in length typed. So to give you a ballpark as to what maybe the expectation should be in your class, I would say students should type an essay that's at least half a page in length. That should be an appropriate length for their narrative. In the essays that scored a 4, most of them used more than 2 characters. So there, I believe, was 1 or 2 essays or narratives that did not, but the majority of the narratives that earned 4 points used more than 2 characters. Dialogue was used in almost every narrative that got a 4. The ones that didn't use dialogue and got a 4 had a plethora of description. Every single event in the 4s is going to be developed with details and description. And the word choice in 4th grade is noticeably of a higher level than the 3rd grade narratives were. So you will see the student, and I've circled some of these words for you, are using words that really paint a picture in the minds of the reader. Taper did not go over to Henry. Taper raced over to Henry. When Harry asked a question, it doesn't just say Henry asked nervously. Henry hung his head, right? We can really infer how Henry was feeling from that sentence. Taper was devastated. He wasn't just sad, he was devastated, right? Taper pulled a giant piece of meat, even bigger and juicier, out than the one he lost in the river. So the student was specifically choosing words that allowed us to understand the event vividly and also the characters' responses to the events. The word choice was very intentional in this essay. There are lots and lots of specific narrative transitions that show time is passing. Now, students need to be explicitly taught what a narrative transition word is and how it's different than the transition words they learned when they wrote informative and opinion essays. So first, second, third, next. Those are transition words we typically use in informative and opinion essays. When we are writing a narrative, yes, those words could be used, but you could also use more specific narrative transitions that show time is passing. 2 minutes later, the next instant, immediately, right? So at Top Score, something that we've done to make this easy for students is we have created an entire list of narrative transition words they can keep right in their writers' folders or writers' portfolios, and they can use and refer to in their writing independently. A really quick revision, if you have students who are not using narrative transitions, is to give them a narrative transition word list and say, hey, go back to your story and just draw some carrots and insert some narrative transition words where you think they're appropriate. Not only does it make the story more vivid and interesting for your reader, but it also, guess what it's going to do? It's going to allow those events to unfold more naturally, right? And again, in this level 4, finally, you will notice that there are some errors, but there is not a pattern of grammar, convention, or spelling errors, and they do not take away from the meaning of the essay. Now let's take a look at a 3. Okay, so this is sample number 4 from that 4th grade set. This student earned 3 points. Right away, we see it's shorter, less than half a page. It has 2 characters. That is something that we saw in the majority of essays that earned a 3. There were only 2 characters. Remember, in the 4s, there was more than 2 usually. There's going to be less description, less developments of events. The events are going to be very abrupt, go from one to the other. There's less descriptive, sensory, colorful language used throughout. The word choice overall, less sophisticated. The errors are going to be more frequent. They do not have a significant effect on the meaning, but they are enough that they do take away some of the understanding on the part of the reader. There are some details from the passages, the source passages in the essays that scored a 3, but there's not as many details. There's not as much information in the 3 essays as there were in the 4 essays. Now this, if I have to say my number one issue I hear from teachers, it's this. My students don't develop events. So yes, maybe they know how to plan for a narrative. Maybe they know to have 3 events, but they write 1 or 2 sentences for each event. And I ask them to write more, and I ask them to describe it, and I ask them to use those sensory language, and they tell me they can't. They have nothing more to say. They wrote about the event. So a quick trick that we have used in the past year at Top Score that really helps those students, and they may be some of your more reluctant writers, is to encourage them to act it out. So we invite them to come up to the front of the classroom and we say, okay, maybe your event is Taper stole a steak and you can't think of anything else to write. That's the whole event. Well, can you come up front, pretend you are Taper and you are stealing a steak, act it out. And the student is going to do all kinds of things when they're at the front of the room. Maybe they're sniffing around. Maybe they pick it up with their mouth. Maybe they kick it with their paw, right? But when they are acting out this 1 sentence event, go sit in their seat and use a Post-it note to just make a bulleted list of all the little things that they do when they're acting out this 1 sentence event. And when they're done acting it out, everyone applauds. And when they come back to their seat, you hand them the Post-it note and you say, now, when you were actually acting out that 1 sentence event, you did all of these things. Go ahead and rewrite that event. But this time, don't just write 1 sentence about the event, rewrite the event so that all of the things you acted out are in your story. Oftentimes that helps students learn how to take these short events that lack all description and really expand upon them. So that's one technique that we here at Top Score have seen to be effective. Another great tool, like we mentioned with those narrative transition lists, word lists of all kinds for your students that lack the vocabulary intrinsically to know how to describe events, giving them a list of sense words, giving them a list of color words, giving them tools that they can use to incorporate some more sophisticated, precise, or descriptive language in their essays can be very helpful. All right, finally, for 4th grade, let's look at what we don't want to do. Okay, so this is sample number 11. Now remember, there's 12 samples in 4th grade. This is number 11. This student earned a 1. So what do we see? It's 1 sentence, right? Same thing we saw in the level 1s in 3rd grade. There's only 1 character. The situation's only going to be minimally introduced because guess what? It's only 1 sentence. There is no real true narrative here. There's no beginning, middle, and end. It's too short. There's very little, if any, description. There's no dialogue. There's no transitions because, again, we don't have events. So how could we utilize narrative transitions? Very little information from the sources have been integrated into this story. And there are errors that are severe enough that they are affecting the readability. So these, again, are common trends that we're seeing in level 1s. Finally, let's take a look at the 5th grade samples. And we're going to look at the 5th grade samples very briefly because remember, 4th and 5th grade expectations are almost identical. Now the 5th grade writing task said, imagine that you are a Livermore firefighter in 1903. Write an original story in which a firefighter convinces the fire chief to take the Sentinel light bulb with them when they move to Station 1. Use ideas from a bright little worker to develop your story. That's important, that last sentence. There are two sources in this text set, but the prompt is directing students to only write in response to one of them. Use ideas from a bright little worker to develop your story. So that's only the first source. Again, we see the importance of analyzing prompts. This is a student that scored a 4 in 5th grade. And this is a great example of all of the students that scored 4s in 5th grade. Basically, we're going to see the same things we saw in 4th grade, right? We're going to see that established situation. We're going to see 3 or more characters. We're going to see description. We're going to see dialogue. We're going to see events that unfold naturally and narrative transitions, all that good stuff, which I think we've gone over in depthly. So I just want to point out the things in 5th grade that we noticed that were different from 4th grade. And you see at the bottom under observations of sample narratives that earned a 4, there's a quote, and this quote comes directly from the state of Georgia. It said narrative techniques were used to develop rich, interesting experiences and events and to show the responses of characters to situations. So here at Top Score, we work to define that for you. What narrative techniques develop rich, interesting experiences? And then you'll see a list. Dialogue that includes slang. So instead of just using dialogue, look at how this 5th grader wrote. So we're actually moving to a new station. He had some interesting memories. He was guessing it's time for fate to step in. Do you see how the student is incorporating a little bit more voice? They're incorporating some slang into the story in order to allow the reader to develop a deeper understanding, a more rich reading experience. The student is using a great deal of sensory language. They describe each event and each person in depthly. From this sample, you really get a good idea of what kind of person Watson is and what kind of person Paul is. Some of them are using puns. Some of them are making jokes. Some of them are begging. Some of them are a little mischievous and they ask things innocently when they really know the answer. So the student here has really taken the time to develop the events, the situations, and the characters due to their word choice and due to their descriptive techniques that they've used. The personalities of these characters is very clear by the time you get to the end of the story. The students used really creative narrative transitions to show how one event transitions to the next. There are multiple details from the source, I should say, woven seamlessly into this story. So the student has just dropped in detail after detail after detail in a very natural way. For a student to be able to do this, they really need to have a good understanding of narrative plot elements. They really need to analyze the information that they were given in order to incorporate that into their story. So for example, as we talked about in 4th grade, if they're writing a story where the setting should be the same, they really need to know how to analyze the setting of the source in order to maintain it in their original story. So you see on the right-hand side, we have a teaching tip for you here. Setting is more than just where the story takes place. Setting is the location, but it's also the time period and it's also the environment, right? We want our students to be able to analyze a literary source and determine the setting so they can maintain it in their own original narrative. Or in this case, the student isn't reading a literary text set, right? They're reading an informational text set. They're creating their own original story, which guess what? That means they get to make up their own setting for the most part. We want our students to know when they're making up their own setting, don't just tell us where it takes place. In this case, a fire station. Be more descriptive. Tell us or give us clues as to also the time period, the environment, and the location. And the student does that in this example based upon their descriptive language, the dialogue, and the way the characters talk. So really the difference we see from 5th grade to 4th grade is the amount of description and the word choice that is used in the narratives. Besides that, the expectations for 5th grade are almost identical to the expectations for 4th grade. Now we know that time is of the essence. So in order to help your students meet these demands that they're going to face on the Georgia Milestones assessment, we have created a Georgia boot camp that you may find helpful. And so basically, what we have identified are the lessons that are crucial in our curriculum to helping your students learn the skills that they will need to use on the Georgia Milestones State Assessment. And this goes both for the informative and opinion writing tasks as well as the narrative tasks. We are completely aligned to your Georgia standards. So if you're ever interested in learning more about our boot camp, or if you would like to see our standards correlation charts, please feel free to email me and I'd be happy to send them your way. Again, my email address is Jen, at topscorewriting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more. I really hope you found this presentation today helpful and enlightening, and I appreciate everyone attending today. I hope to hear from you soon.